Hello everyone, this video is going to be a walkthrough of two sections, the hemic and lymphatic and mediastinum and diaphragm systems in your 2022 CPT. I will also do a walkthrough of a couple of questions from these sections. So before we jump into that, I kind of wanted to clarify what are these systems and why do we separate them out? Because if you do look in your manual, you'll see that they are kind of nested with the cardiovascular system, and that is because they are very closely related, and also they're much smaller sections. Um, and so they don't really justify their own special chapter, but they are different enough that we want to take a little bit of time to kind of clarify their purpose and the different kinds of procedures you will see related to these systems. So the hemic and lymphatic, if you've taken medical terminology, you might recognize that hemic is related to blood. So that's when we're talking about white blood cells, red blood cells. If we talk about bone marrow, anything like that, we're talking about the hemic system. Lymphatic system is also kind of enmeshed in that, and that's what we're looking at, the spleen and the lymph nodes and that whole lymphatic kind of channels and structures. And those are the structures that remove excess liquid from the body and also help with some breakdown of some other chemicals. The main diagnoses that you'll see in these sections are going to be related to infections, swelling, and also cancer. So if you are familiar with cancer or you've heard anything about like surgeries related to cancer, you might have heard, oh, it's spread to the lymph nodes. You'll see that a lot when we're working in this section, okay? What's the mediastinum or mediastinum and diaphragm? The mediastinum is the area that is between the lungs and it houses all of those structures. So obviously this is going to be closely related with cardiovascular because that is where the heart is. And then the diaphragm is the muscle that is just below the lungs, and that's the main muscle that helps you breathe. So if you've ever been in like choir or singing of any kind, you might be familiar with strengthening your diaphragm and how you can actually do that. So those are the two structures that are in this section. And the code range that we're looking at is 38100 to 39599. And I point that out because if you watched my video on the cardiovascular system, you might remember a little bit of discussion about how the 30,000 series will have a specific number of questions on the national exam. So this is going to be included in that 30,000 series, all right? And then also, do want to point out that it is very closely associated with the cardiovascular system. So some textbooks or workbooks and or practice exams may kind of roll it all into one. And we'll look at the manual itself so that will make a little bit more sense. All right, so we have our 2022 CPT, and as always, our tabs, our highlighter, our pen. If you have already tabbed your CPT, you might have noted that there is not a pre-made tab for the cardiovascular system, and that is because, and the cardiovascular system starts on 239, and that is because it is nested in here with the cardiovascular system. It starts on 244. And that is where hemic and lymphatic starts. And then the next page is mediastinum and diaphragm. And we have a great spot here for notes as well. When we look at the breakdown, you'll note that we have one section just for the spleen because that's the only true organ that we look at. And then the rest, there's a general section. There's a section for transplantation. That's mainly for like cellular infusions and things like that. And then lymph nodes and lymphatic channels that get their own section. We kind of have a few catch-all codes in there as well. And then for mediastinum and diaphragm, they are very, very short sections. And there's just one section for mediastinum and one for the diaphragm. It's super brief. So I'm going to go to these sections and look at the codes real quickly. And I don't know if I pointed this out, I did make my own tabs here for lymphatic and mediastinum as well. The codes themselves start on 334. All right. So here are the codes themselves. As I said, we have a section just for the spleen, and it's got those very familiar procedure sections, subsections in here: excision, repair, laparoscopy, and introduction, which is going to be like, remember, injections. And so really, really short. That way, you know, the spleen has its own section. Then we have a general section, which is going to be related to stem cells, bone marrow, other kinds of platelets, and general like biopsies. So that will be here in the general section. Also, there's some really good diagrams here or illustrations here that are super helpful to kind of understand what some of these procedures are. Then we get into transplantation and cellular infusions. That has a good little explanation here that is continued on the next page. Anytime you see if it's just a few paragraphs, just go ahead and read it through. It does help you understand that section a little bit better. And then we get into a section just for the lymph nodes and lymphatic channels. And again, we're going to have our very familiar procedure subsections: incision, excision. And then we get into limited lymphadenectomy for staging, a laparoscopy, and radical lymphadenectomy. So I wanted to point out, as you can see here, I've really pointed out to myself the difference between limited and radical. So limited, the purpose of these codes here, let me highlight them, are what? Are for staging. So staging is when we are trying to determine the stage. If you are talking about cancer, you might have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and so on and so forth. We are trying to determine the extent, the stage of a specific condition. So limited is just going to be when we remove just that lymph node or remove part of it. For this purpose, for staging. When we get into radical, that's going to be a much more aggressive procedure. You can see that it is including resection. Anytime we are doing something, you see these terms radical or resection, that means we are removing not just that lymph node or that structure, we are removing everything around it. So we are taking out all of the vessels or any other material that's surrounding that lymph node. So it's much, much more aggressive procedures here. And so we would not be doing this for staging. We would be doing this as an aggressive form of treatment for something. And then we do have laparoscopy up here, and always check out these little guidances here. Good thing to note, always remind yourself, surgical laparoscopy always includes diagnostic. This also tells you that if you want to report just a diagnostic laparoscopy, then you can use this code 49320, which is in a different section. So that does help us because we know it does exist. It's just not in this section. For this, you'll also want to note there's a lot of parenthetical guidance here, which can be very helpful, especially when it tells you what not to report these codes with. Things like this can be super, super helpful because chances are on your national exam, they are going to give you this code with this code, right? And so then you'll be able to eliminate that option. Okay, and then we have an, sure I'm in the right section. Okay, yes, we're still in the radical. Then we have an introduction section, and then kind of a catch-all other procedures section here. One thing I did want to note, whenever we are talking about lymph nodes, you do most likely need to specify laterality if we're talking about something that might be paired. So if you're talking about um, left arm and right arm, left breast, breast, you would use the right, which is RT or LT for left, or you would use modifier 50 to indicate bilateral. So if it's both, all right. So the lymphatic system, lymph nodes are paired for some portions of the body, particularly when we're talking about breasts or arms. And so you will indicate laterality for those procedures. Just something to keep in mind. Mediastinum and diaphragm, we get into that. Again, like I said, it's super short. Mediastinum just has incision, excision, resection, endoscopy, and other. So if you're going to get a code for mediastinum or diaphragm, I would just come and look them up because there's so few codes. Really is not too much of a waste of time to do that. Then we get into diaphragm, we just have repair, and then we have other procedures. The repair section has some great parenthetical guidance. So go ahead and follow that because that always helps. So again, for those sections, I would probably just flip to those codes and look at them directly. And then there's a really good spot here for notes. All right, so I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint and we will do a walkthrough of a couple of codes. Okay. So for this question, we are looking at the injection procedure for identification of the sentinel node with intradermal radioisotope injection for the staging of clinically negative axillary in a patient with primary malignant neoplasm of the central portion of the right breast. Wow, that is a mouthful. That's almost like a note right there, a report right there. Okay, so let's pull out what is most important here. So we know we're looking at an injection, and we know the purpose of that injection is to identify this sentinel node. We don't necessarily need to know what that means, but we know node is probably going to be related to lymph node, correct? And so it's an injection to identify a specific node, and it includes a radioisotope. So this is a radioisotope, would indicate to us that it's radioactive. So it's some kind of marker or some kind of radioactive substance that's helping us identify this specific node in the patient. So then it tells us here, and I've just underlined it, for the staging of clinically negative axillary. So we are the purpose of this injection with the radioactive material is to stage something, okay? And then we know that the patient has primary malignant neoplasm of the central portion of the right breast, okay? And then generally what I wanted to kind of mention there, whenever we're talking about breast cancer, we generally assume that the patient is female unless it is noted otherwise, all right? So let's go ahead and look these up, and I'll show you how I would do it if I was on the national exam. Because this looks really, really tricky when you are just reading through it, so it might be kind of overwhelming. Okay. So this is our CPT code that we're looking for, an injection of radioactive for the purpose of identifying the sentinel node, okay? So it's some kind of radioactive injection. The way that I would do this, honestly, if I was on a national exam, I would look up this term here. So say all of this, because this is radioactive injection seems like something that could apply to a lot of different circumstances, and it might be difficult just to find that really quickly in the index. But if I was in the national exam, I would try to look up that sentinel node and see if that was available. And then I might look at injection. Okay. So on page 1225, we do have a category just for sentinel node, so that helps, right? We have excision, identification, and intraoperative identification. So we look at identification because that's what we're trying to do, right? We are trying to identify the sentinel node. Identification with an injection of radioactive tracer. So that really hits everything that we're looking for. We have a radioactive injection for the identification of the sentinel node. And that's sending us to 38792. Okay, so then I will go and look that up and see if that's an appropriate code. Mm. Okay, so we are in introduction. That's where our we'd have our injection procedures, right? In the lymphatic system. And 38792 is indicating it's an injection procedure with a radioactive tracer for identification of sentinel node. Then we have all this guidance in here. If we're doing an excision, if we're doing imaging, and if we are doing mapping of some kind that included non-radioactive dye. So those situations do not apply to what we have in our documentation, but this all does. Radioactive tracer for identification of sentinel node, injection procedure 38792. Awesome. So that's the code we're going to use. And then we do know that this is a right breast. So we are going to go ahead and add that modifier because it is a paired organ, okay? Or structure. All right. So then we will go ahead and look up our ICD-10. I know I don't usually do ICD-10 for these, but I thought, why not? Let's do one. Okay, so we are looking for malignant neoplasm of the central portion of the right breast. At this point, we should know we're not going to go to the index. We are going to go to the table of neoplasms. Okay, we're going to look for breast. Okay, here's breast on 484 at the bottom here. We are looking at the central portion. And we know this first category is our malignant primary. And that's what our documentation has told us. It's primary malignant neoplasm of the central portion of the right breast. Now, so far all we know is central portion, primary malignant neoplasm. So we're going to go to C50.1. See if we can find a more specific code because we do have that red stop sign and we couldn't use it as is, even if we wanted to. Okay, so we have C50 is malignant neoplasm of breast. C50.1. Okay, malignant neoplasm of central portion of right breast. And as I said, we assume female unless it is specified as male. And then we know we are looking for the right breast. Okay. So we have malignant neoplasm of central portion of right breast. It's going to be C50.111. Okay. Up here, when we look at the top of the section, it's going to tell us what's included. We don't have any documentation about any of that, but it also says use additional code to identify estrogen receptor status. We do not have information on that, so we do not have to use an additional code. And then it's letting us know this excludes the skin of the breast. We don't have documentation stating this is skin cancer. So we will stick with C50.111. Let's go double check. Well, look here. This should be 111. So I will correct that. But so C50.111 should be 3 ones there. Let's see. Just add a little 1 there. Okay. All right. See, even I make mistakes. All right. So on to the next one. I should probably clear that. A repair of laceration of the diaphragm, abdominal approach. All right. So that seems fairly simple. Repair of diaphragm, abdominal approach. Let's go look at the document camera. All right. We'll flip back to our CPT manual. And remember, as I said, for these codes, I would just look at all the diaphragm codes. And because there's just so few, it just makes more sense to me than trying to go through the index or go through the table of contents. If you know you're working in the diaphragm, just go to the diaphragm. So, all right, so we can read through here. We have repair, so we're probably going to be in this first section here. So we are looking for repair of diaphragm, abdominal approach. The first guidance says for transabdominal repair of diaphragmatic hernia. Okay, we don't have information about it being a hernia. For laparoscopic repair of hernias, we don't have that guidance there, so we don't know about that. And then the next code says repair laceration of diaphragm, any approach. So we're assuming that that would include the abdominal approach. This seems like a good option, but let's quickly check the others. Repair of neonatal. We know we don't have any information about it being neonatal. Repair of hernia other than neonatal. Again, we don't have information about a hernia or it being traumatic. Imbrication of diaphragm. We don't have information about that. Resection. We don't know anything about that either. And this includes with a complex repair. That's a resection with a complex repair here. So we don't have any guidance about that. All we know is repair of diaphragm from an abdominal approach. So I will use this 39501 as my CPT code there. Let's go ahead and check. All right, let's check here. 39501. Great, we did it. Okay, so that's two short, fairly short problems from this section. Those pretty well represent the kind of questions you'll see related to these systems on the national exam. If you do have questions, feel free to post them and we can talk about them together. Thank you all. Bye-bye.